California is one of the largest economies on the planet. It's home to 40 million people, a booming tech scene, Hollywood, major ports, and vast farmland. It's a world power in its own right. It even runs on its own power grid. Breaking away from the US would send shockwaves far beyond its borders, and that possibility may be nearer than you think. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're asking what would really happen if California became its own country. Many Californians, from politicians to everyday residents, feel their state's values are drifting away from the rest of the US, and even that it's under attack. The talk of secession was once tossed around almost like a joke, but now it's become increasingly serious in nature. A new poll by YouGov in June 2025 was reported on by the Independent California Institute, or ICI, and found that 44% of California adults would vote to leave the United States and let their state become an independent country. That's a record high result that has never before been seen as long as these polls have been conducted. Another poll by ICI says that 56% of Californians agree with the statement that the state would be better off if California peacefully seceded from the US at some point in the next 10 years. This has led to groups advocating for an independent California republic and ideas like the Cal-Exit movement. Marcos Ruiz-Evans, a secession advocate from Fresno, says, "I think California values are completely different from American values. They've been that way for a long time. But what would seceding mean for California? What would actually happen step by step if it were to become its own nation? And perhaps even more importantly, how would the US respond?" Well, considering that as of April 2025, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, found that an independent California would be the fourth largest economy in the world, beating even Japan, the state seceding would have a tremendous impact on the US economy, which would immediately lose $4.1 trillion, or 14% of its GDP. Not to mention, the US would also lose almost 40 million citizens, around 11.7% of its population. And the Golden State, or California Republic's future, is looking even rosier based on current trends. The state's economy has grown much faster than the US economy overall, 111% versus 75% in the last 25 years of economic growth. When it comes to per capita income, California's growth is even stronger, outpacing every other large state over the long run. That may be because the state's labor market attracts people from all over the country and the world. Between 1998 and 2023, its workforce grew by 29%, adding 4.1 million jobs compared to the national population growth of 18%. Given all that, the idea that the US would allow California to go on its merry way without pushback seems ludicrous. Never mind that legally both the US and California Constitution are fundamentally against secession. Attorney Annie Lofthouse points out that the state's constitution says that California is inseparable from the US, and the American Constitution has no actual mechanism that allows a state to secede. In fact, when states have tried in the past, it hasn't gone so well. Besides that tiny conflict known as the Civil War, secession movements also resulted in a Supreme Court case known as White v. Texas. And in 1869, the highest judicial body in the land ruled that states cannot secede unless through revolution or with the consent of all the other states. So either the other 49 states work things out, agree on a political path forward and let California go peacefully, or it leaves through a violent, bloody coup. And right now, one of those options looks a lot more likely than the other. In 2025, the leaders of the Cal-Exit movement tried another mechanism for secession. They wanted to collect the almost 547,000 signatures needed to put the question of secession on the 2028 ballot. If the question was on the ballot and half of California's registered voters showed up, a 55% yes vote would amount to a no-confidence verdict in the United States. That result would trigger an examination of how California might function as an independent country. Though the group failed to get the staggering amount of signatures required for the issue to appear on the ballot, Cal-Exit leaders are simply regrouping and trying again. If California wanted to break free, the federal government would likely refuse to recognize the state's secession. California would have to forcefully close down its borders and declare martial law to gain independence. And that would lead to the US federal government sending its Army and National Guard against the former state. Which leads us to our first uncertainty about secession. California is home to a huge amount of significant military bases and training centers. Over 30 major defense installations are located within the state, including Naval Base San Diego, an incredibly strategic significant hub for the Pacific Fleet, Camp Pendleton trains over 40,000 Marines and sailors in preparation for overseas deployment, and then there's the training center at Fort Irwin, Edwards Air Force Base, and Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. The U.S. would not let go of those bases without a fight, especially the West Coast's biggest naval base that gives the country access to the Pacific Ocean. And a fight would also depend on what the soldiers inside and outside of California did. Would the new California Republic seize them and order them to defend the state? It's possible, but most of the soldiers are from outside of California, and many would hesitate to fire on people who just minutes earlier were their fellow Americans. Incoming members of the U.S. Army and National Guard would face a similar dilemma, with many reluctant to fire on people they perceive as fellow countrymen. That's not to mention the fact that California contributes the largest number of military recruits to both active duty and reserve forces. There are over 184,000 service members out of around 2.1 million total, active duty and reserve, hailing from California. The number accounts for 8.8% of total forces. Even if a bloody conflict were avoided, California would have to figure out how to raise enough money for its own army as a new country. One option would be to call back all the U.S. military members that hail from the state to defend the new republic. But how would the state fund their new military? Well, here is where seceding might actually put some more money in California's pockets. In the federal fiscal year of 2022, Californians paid $692.2 billion in taxes to the federal government and received only $609.1 billion in federal funds. That means the state gives $83.1 billion more than it receives. To give you an idea of how massive that is, California's tax collection makes up 14.1% of the entire U.S. government's $4.9 trillion haul. The shortfall alone would be larger than what 30 individual states pay in total federal taxes each. UPenn professor of political science Brendan O'Leary points out that California contributes more tax revenue to the federal government by far than any other state in the union. This funding is absolutely crucial for all sorts of Republican states, for which California simply receives abuse in return. In fact, those resentments are part of what underline the rumblings of California's secession. Some residents feel it's unfair that their relatively high taxes help prop up many of the same states that keep hurling insults at them. Instead of sending those billions to the federal U.S. government, the new republic could keep them to set up their own military, as well as all the new departments and offices it would need. A Department of State, for example. However, it would still fall short of the might of the U.S. Army, the world's largest military power, and tilt the balance of power away from California in all future conflicts and negotiations. Seceding from the U.S. would also automatically make California a non-nuclear power, putting it at a significant disadvantage when it comes to foreign conflicts and relations. As for the U.S. itself, the loss of California would likely cause severe shortfalls in federal programs that help some of the country's most financially underperforming areas and poorest people. Then there's the money that goes toward programs like Social Security, Medicare, and others. It would also likely cause the value of the dollar to absolutely plummet, putting it in danger of being replaced as the global currency by something else, like the euro. That being said, California's current economic situation isn't so hot either. According to the Legislative Analyst's Office, the enacted state budget for 2025 to 2026 projects a $20 billion budget deficit after a few years in a row of such deficits. Seceding from the U.S. federal government would also mean losing 50% of the state's medical costs, about $200 billion a year via Medicare, Medi-Cal, Obamacare, and military and federal retiree coverage. In addition, the federal government pays $100 billion in Social Security to California recipients. Citizenship would also immediately become an issue. Part of the reasons for secession have to do with the majority of Californians disagreeing with the current actions of the U.S. federal government. How many would choose to stay in California if it became its own country? A July 2025 survey by the Public Policy Institute of California may give us some answers. It found that 80% of Californians have lost trust in the federal government, believing it only does what's right either some of the time or not at all. This represents a 12% increase in distrust of the U.S. government since September 2024. Opposition to the federal government in California is only increasing under the current administration, so it's reasonable to think that at least 80% of the population, and perhaps even more, would choose to stay and become California citizens in a new republic. One option would be to maintain dual U.S. citizenship, but this would require a peaceful secession process. If the state left the Union through violent means, Californians who opposed the new republic and wanted to return to the U.S. would likely have to apply for citizenship again and face rigorous screening in the process. The question of citizenship becomes even more complicated when you factor in property and family ties. Many U.S. residents own secondary homes in California, or primary homes there and secondary somewhere else. Others have family living or studying in different parts of the country, or work across state borders. Does a student from North Carolina currently studying at Berkeley become an international student? How do things work for a divorced couple when the mother and son live in Sacramento but the father lives in Nevada and has visitation rights? What happens to U.S. remote workers who work for California-based companies? These questions would all become a huge headache. Internationally, California could rejoin several organizations and agreements the U.S. has recently left, including UNESCO, the World Health Organization, and the Paris Agreement. Given its strong push for green energy, we'll talk more about that later, it would almost certainly want back in on that last one. Domestically, one of the biggest problems is the political climate in the U.S. would shift overnight. Congress would immediately lose one of its bluest states, leading to a sudden shift to the right. Thanks to its population, California has the most electoral votes of any state, 55, and the most congressional representatives, 2 in the Senate and 52 in the House of Representatives. Currently, 43 of those representatives are Democrats. California exiting would immediately swing the balance of the House of Representatives from a slim Republican majority, 219 to 212, to a massive one, 210 to 169. And that would put a dent in any hope of a Democratic majority in the near future. Political scientist at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, Stephen Seidemann, says politically this would put Democrats in a deep, deep hole. The new United States would be unlikely to see any Democrat president elected in the near future unless all Democrats shifted their politics much further to the right. For that reason, a new California republic might also trigger the secession of other deep blue states across the country, particularly the grouping of solidly Democratic voting states in the Northeast. Finding themselves now way to the left of U.S. politics and feeling their interests no longer represented, every state northeast of and including New York and New Jersey might just up and leave. This new political alignment would also affect international alliances, as a newly and suddenly right-shifting U.S. would likely cozy up more to further right-wing, more authoritarian governments. The relationships with more liberal countries, including longtime allies like Canada and the European Union, would start to crumble. Meanwhile, California's alliances would likely move in exactly the opposite direction. Speaking of alliances, trade would quickly become a complicated issue. Countless international trade agreements would have to be renegotiated, likely for both countries, as the U.S. would now need to import a whole lot of things it used to just get domestically from California. On top of that, America's shipping industry is heavily tilted toward the Golden State. The Port of Los Angeles is not only the busiest port in the United States, but one of the 15 busiest ports in the world. In 2021 alone, it handled $291 billion in cargo, and in 2024, 10.3 million 20-foot equivalent units in cargo. Long Beach, also located in California, became the second busiest port in the country just a couple years ago, handling 9.65 million TEUs. Both ports are incredibly important when it comes to Asian imports into the U.S., in addition to being home to the largest car import facility in North America. They're also fast-growing in terms of cargo handling and capacity, with an increase of 19 to 20% from 2023 to 2024. In total, California had a total of 14 ports that handle 40% of all U.S. containerized imports and 30% of all exports. The U.S. could shift some of its imports and exports to ports like Seattle, but other harbors and facilities would have to immediately start building up their capabilities to even have a shot of handling the trade California's ports currently do. And trade with the U.S. would have to be figured out as well. Does the U.S. do an EU-like agreement with the new California Republic, where goods flow easily and duty-free between the two countries? That would lessen the impact on the U.S. of losing its most important parts, but as with most decisions after secessions, the method of leaving the Union would determine how understanding the two new countries would be with one another. However, creating near tariff-free trade would benefit the new U.S. and California Republic. California produces 9% of the country's current international exports of goods, totaling $179 billion in 2023, and 20% of its exports of services, totaling $179 billion in 2022. This includes 18% of computer and electronic products, as well as 17% of U.S. agricultural products. Not to mention, the state also produces 11 to 13% of the U.S.'s domestic food supply, delivering over a third of the country's vegetables and 3/4 of its fruits and nuts. If it became a different country, any tariffs between the U.S. and the California Republic would cause grocery prices throughout the country to skyrocket, as the nearest producer of many top commodities would suddenly be exporting them across borders. Also, there's the matter of U.S. soft power, much of it driven by tourism and the global promotion of its most famous cities and states. And most of all, its media. Every major studio and most production companies are currently based in California. It's likely that the U.S. would lose its lead in pop culture and soft global media influence that it has now, while California would surge ahead in that industry. And speaking of California-based industries that make the current world turn, Silicon Valley would suddenly find itself outside of the U.S., meaning the top tech companies of our time, Google, Apple, Meta, Nvidia, just to name a few, would now be operating out of California, not the USA. The US would actually have huge issues trying to negotiate replacements for those industries, as globally there really aren't any. Silicon Valley and Hollywood just aren't the national leaders in tech and media, but the global leaders as well. Though all of this makes it seem like California is set up to thrive, it faces its own huge hurdles in its newfound independence, in addition to some of the challenges mentioned before. How does the state rewrite its laws? How does it negotiate new trade deals with plenty of leverage but not the same pull it had as part of the world's biggest economy and military power? Not to mention the significant percentage of Californians that did not want to secede would cause an immediate problem for the newfound country. Would they move to what remains of the United States, start their own secession movement, or simply try to overthrow the new California government? Even for industries thriving in California, some companies within them, like Tesla most famously, have already started moving to different states to take advantage of more favorable tax laws. It's possible that California seceding would trigger a mass exodus of companies going into other U.S. states with lower corporate taxes. That being said, California still leads the nation by far in Fortune 500 companies, 58 in total, compared to 54 in Texas and 53 in New York. It's also home to 33 of the world's 50 leading AI companies, a quarter of all patents and conference papers in the field, and it ranks first in the U.S. for access to venture capital and high-tech industries. Not to mention, it's home to some of the country's best scientific minds at universities like Caltech, Berkeley, and Stanford, and institutions like NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Businesses might have tax incentives to leave the California Republic, but they'd also be giving up massive venture capital funding, a highly educated workforce, and a wealth of tech and scientific innovation. On top of that, many California businesses, and U.S. businesses in general, have been unhappy with the higher prices paid under the current U.S. administration's changing tariff policies and the resulting economic damage. In just the first 6 months of 2025, California is estimated to have lost $16 billion in revenue, both directly and indirectly as the result of tariff policies. This prompted Governor Gavin Newsom to file a lawsuit challenging the president's ability to enact tariffs without oversight or congressional approval. If the federal government keeps pushing anti-free trade, high tariff policies, while the new California Republic strikes better deals with major partners like China, many businesses might choose to stay. Those favorable agreements could outweigh the downside of paying slightly higher taxes. There are less prominent but equally as important issues to contend with as well. For example, Southern California currently gets a lot of its water from the Colorado River system, which it shares with Arizona and Nevada. This division has already made things dicey when the fight over water rights was just between the states. There have been disputes over allocation and usage, leading to multiple renegotiations and even a Supreme Court case. But if that fight shifts to between countries, faced with increased droughts and shortages, the states already agreed to cut their water use by 20% when reservoir levels drop. The origin of the river system is in Colorado, and the water flows through Nevada and Arizona before reaching California. Therefore, the two states could theoretically cut off the new California Republic's water supply if things reached a boiling point. This would severely affect not only drinking water for Southern Californians, but the state's thriving agricultural industry. Almost 70 to 80% of the water California uses coming from the Colorado River, or about 3.1 million acre-feet per year, is allocated for agriculture. Additionally, California has a bit of an advantage energy-wise. It already has its own independent energy grid operated by the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, but it still significantly relies on energy imports from other states to function. In 2019, for example, California was the largest net electricity importer in the country, bringing in more than 70.8 million megawatt-hours, about 25% of its total supply. The state also imports 76% of its crude oil and 93% of its natural gas. That being said, almost all of those imports come from other countries, not other parts of the U.S. So secession may not affect California's energy dependence as much as others may think. California has also been focusing on building up its green energy production. The sunny state is fast ramping up its clean energy production capabilities, particularly when it comes to solar power. In 2023, the state achieved a new goal of being powered by 2/3 clean energy. That's compared to only 41% in 2013. Then in 2024, California added another 7,000 megawatts of clean capacity to its power grid in an effort to reach its goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. In fact, this is yet another industry California leads nationally, ranking first for its huge clean energy workforce of almost 545,000 jobs in 2023, 7 times more than fossil fuel jobs available in the state. As much of the world moves toward clean energy, this focus on renewable energy may help California's economy surge even further ahead. There's also the matter of immigration. Historically, California has been more pro-immigration than the average American state. According to the Public Policy Institute of California, a massive 27% of the state is foreign-born, compared to 12% on average for the U.S. as a whole. It's reasonable to believe that California, especially with its booming industries and thriving economy, would adopt more pro-immigration policies. This could, on one hand, cause a boom in population that the state would have to struggle to support in terms of housing, infrastructure expansion, and services. But it could also trigger a brain and labor drain across the rest of the U.S. as workers in tech, entertainment, aerospace, and agriculture move to be closer to the new hub of their industry. Others might simply take advantage of California's strong job market and economic opportunities. Unfortunately, this would also have the side effect of increasing already unaffordable housing prices in the short term, forcing many locals out. According to the California Association of Realtors, California already has the second highest median home prices in the country, behind only Hawaii, with the median sale price for single-family homes in April 2025 being just over $904,000. Overall, it's clear that California may be capable of secession on paper, but the practical challenges of independence, as well as the political, economic, and logistical costs, would be huge for both California and the United States. Then again, countries have managed to secede before, so who knows? If California went its own way, it could set off a chain reaction across the nation. Watch What If the USA Broke Up to see how the rest of the country might follow, or click on this video instead.